Putin declared a ceasefire for Orthodox Easter, and within the first 7 hours Ukraine's military recorded 2,299 violations. Russia's defense ministry responded by claiming Ukraine committed 1971 violations of its own. Both sides were accusing each other of breaking a ceasefire that had barely started while soldiers were still firing across a 1,200-kilometer front line. And then the Kremlin announced it would not extend the truce. Just like that, it was over. But here is the part that nobody is saying out loud. This was not a ceasefire that collapsed. This was a performance that ended on schedule. And if you look at what Russia has actually been doing at the negotiating table over the past year, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. What a ceasefire is supposed to look like. Before going deeper into what Russia is actually doing, it is worth establishing what a genuine ceasefire process looks like when both sides actually want one. Because the contrast with what is happening in Ukraine right now is stark. A genuine ceasefire process involves pre-negotiated terms that both sides agree to before the announcement is made. It involves monitoring mechanisms with neutral third-party observers who can verify compliance and attribute violations. It involves consequences for violations that create real incentives to comply. And it involves a structured pathway from the ceasefire itself toward the broader political negotiations that will determine the final outcome. None of those elements were present in the Easter ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Putin announced it unilaterally on a Thursday. It was framed as a gesture of goodwill for a religious holiday. It lasted 32 hours. There were no monitoring mechanisms. There were no consequences for violations. And the Kremlin said explicitly that it would not extend the ceasefire unless Ukraine accepted Russia's terms. Terms that Ukraine has consistently rejected for 4 years because accepting them would mean the end of Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. What happened on April 12, 2026 was not a peace process. It was a press release with artillery fire running in the background, the negotiating table that Russia never actually joined. To understand what is really being hidden between Russia and Ukraine, you have to look at what has happened at the actual negotiating table since early 2026. Because the picture that emerges from that analysis is genuinely alarming. The first round of trilateral negotiations involving the US, Russia, and Ukraine took place in late January 2026. The second round followed in early February. A third round happened in Geneva in mid-February. On the surface, this looks like progress. 3 rounds of talks in less than 2 months. Analysts at the time described momentum building. But what was actually happening inside those rooms tells a completely different story. Russia sent its GRU chief Igor Kostyukov to lead its delegation in the early rounds. Analysts at New Eastern Europe examined that choice carefully, and their conclusion was striking. Sending the head of military intelligence to lead peace negotiations rather than diplomatic representatives signals that Moscow perceives these discussions as operational planning sessions for favorable conflict termination rather than genuine peace negotiations recognizing Ukrainian statehood. In other words, Russia was not sending its diplomats to make peace. It was sending its spies to gather information and manage the optics of appearing cooperative without committing to anything. The pattern across all 3 rounds was identical. Technical progress on secondary issues. Absolute deadlock on every question that actually matters. Agreements on procedural matters like monitoring frameworks and humanitarian access protocols. Zero movement on territory, zero movement on security guarantees, and zero movement on Russia's maximalist demands regarding Ukraine's future status. Atlantic Council analysts described this pattern with precision. Russia is using US-led negotiations to stall for time and divide the transatlantic alliance. Putin has refused to join Ukraine in accepting an unconditional ceasefire and continues to insist on maximalist goals that would mean the end of an independent Ukrainian state. And then there is the detail about Russia's lead negotiator Vladimir Medinsky, who returned to lead delegations in later rounds. Medinsky is not primarily known as a diplomat. He is primarily known for writing radically anti-Ukrainian history textbooks that deny Ukrainian national identity. Sending him to negotiate Ukraine's future is not a coincidence. It is a message. The Kushner Principle and why 90% progress means nothing. Ukraine's chief negotiator Rustem Umerov said in early 2026 that 90% of the peace plan had already been agreed upon. That statement generated considerable optimism in Western capitals. It was cited repeatedly as evidence that a deal was getting close. Understanding why that 90% figure is misleading requires understanding what analysts have called the Kushner Principle. The negotiating structure that Jared Kushner helped design for these talks deliberately segregates everything from territorial matters. It addresses non-territorial issues first. It makes technical agreements on monitoring mechanisms, forced disengagement procedures and humanitarian access. It creates the tactical appearance of progress while the impossibility of strategic resolution remains completely untouched. The 90% that has been agreed consists almost entirely of secondary procedural questions. The 10% that has not been agreed contains every single issue that actually determines the outcome of the war. Who controls the 4 Ukrainian regions Russia has annexed? Whether NATO troops can deploy to Ukraine as security guarantors. What happens to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant? What limits, if any, are placed on Ukraine's military? Whether Russia's demands for official status for the Russian language in Ukraine are accepted. These are not technical details to be worked out. These are the fundamental questions that define whether Ukraine survives as an independent country. And on every single one of them Russia has shown zero flexibility in any negotiating round. Harvard professor Graham Allison put the core problem plainly in an analysis that was widely circulated. Putin is demanding that Ukraine withdraw from the last part of Donbass his forces have not yet seized, while Zelensky refuses to surrender at the table what Ukrainian troops have held on the battlefield. That one sentence captures the entire impasse. Russia wants everything it has taken plus everything it has not taken yet. Ukraine refuses to give away at the negotiating table what its soldiers died to defend on the front line, what Russia is actually doing while talking. While negotiations have been proceeding, Russia has not paused its military campaign. The battlefield picture during the period of active negotiations tells you everything about Moscow's actual intentions. Russian forces captured Siversk during the negotiating period. They continued advancing in eastern Donetsk. Putin claimed in a conversation with Trump that Ukrainian control of the Donetsk region had fallen from 35% to between 15 and 17%. Russia launched a massive strike on Kyiv just hours before a scheduled round of US-Ukraine talks. Russian drones have been hitting Ukrainian substations across the country throughout the winter in a deliberate campaign to destroy Ukraine's heating and power infrastructure before spring. Former CIA Director William Burns stated directly that Putin is not serious about peace at this point. Burns, who visited Ukraine 14 times during the war and has spent decades studying Russian decision-making, characterized Putin as overconfident and said the war's unexpectedly high costs, including an estimated 1.1 million Russian casualties and severe economic strain, have generated internal disaffection inside Russia. But Burns was careful to note that internal pressure has not translated into genuine movement toward compromise. The Atlantic Council's assessment is equally direct. Putin's army is advancing in Ukraine and retains the upper hand in a war of attrition that strongly favors Russia. With the Ukrainian military suffering from increasingly acute manpower shortages and Kyiv's allies showing growing signs of weakening resolve, Putin remains confident that he can achieve a decisive breakthrough in 2026. That confidence is the core reason he has no incentive to make real concessions at the negotiating table. Russia is advancing on the battlefield. Russia is managing the optics of engagement at the negotiating table. Russia is waiting for Western resolve to fracture. And Russia is using every theatrical ceasefire announcement to signal to international audiences that it is the reasonable party while continuing to fire across a 1,200-kilometer front line, the history of broken promises that explains everything. To understand why Ukraine's skepticism about any Russian ceasefire commitment is not paranoia but documented pattern recognition, you have to look at the history. In 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum. It surrendered the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Russia signed that document. Russia violated it catastrophically 20 years later when it annexed Crimea in 2014 and then again in 2022 when it launched a full-scale invasion. In 2022 Russia and Ukraine came closer to a negotiated settlement than most people now remember. Talks in Istanbul in March 2022 produced a draft framework that both sides were working toward. Ukraine was prepared to accept neutrality and limits on its military in exchange for security guarantees from multiple international powers. The framework collapsed. Russian forces withdrew from around Kiev claiming it was a gesture of goodwill. Then evidence emerged from Bucha and other liberated towns of systematic war crimes committed against civilian populations. Negotiations ended. Russia has signed commitments it violated. Russia has announced ceasefires it immediately breached. Russia has made overtures at the negotiating table while continuing battlefield operations that contradicted every word of those overtures. Since Ukraine regained independence in 1991, Russia has signed a long list of treaties and agreements obliging Moscow to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Every single one of those agreements is now a historical document rather than an active commitment. The ceasefire violation count of 2,299 in the first 7 hours of the Easter truce is not a surprise to anyone in Kiev. It is Tuesday. What Washington is missing while looking at Iran? There is a dimension of what is being hidden between Russia and Ukraine that has nothing to do with Moscow's intentions and everything to do with Washington's attention. The outbreak of the US-Israel war against Iran in February 2026 fundamentally redirected American diplomatic and military energy away from Eastern Europe. The Iran ceasefire negotiations, the Islamabad talks and the Hormuz situation created an immediate crisis environment that pulled senior American foreign policy attention to the Middle East. Ukraine moved from the top of the American agenda to the second tier. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed that the Easter ceasefire announcement was not coordinated with the United States. Russia's envoy Kirill Dmitriev traveled to Washington for meetings with Trump administration officials, but Peskov was careful to clarify that this was not a resumption of peace negotiations. The Kremlin wanted to appear engaged while the American negotiating team was distracted without actually committing to anything that would constrain its military operations. Zelensky read this shift accurately and said it directly. This spring and summer will be quite difficult politically and diplomatically. There will be pressure on Ukraine. There will also be pressure on the battlefield. That was not a general warning about the difficulty of war. It was a specific observation about what happens when the country fighting for its survival loses the focused attention of its most powerful backer. Sigh's analysts described Russia's strategic calculation in this environment with clarity. Moscow doesn't want a good deal. It wants dominion over the 39 million people of Ukraine. And it will not stop there. That assessment frames every ceasefire announcement, every negotiating round and every Easter truce in their proper context. They are not steps toward peace. They are moves in a longer strategic game that Russia believes it is winning. The delegation that tells you everything. One of the most revealing details about Russia's true intentions in the 2026 negotiations is the composition of its delegations. In the January and February rounds, Russia sent its GRU chief to lead negotiations. The GRU is Russia's military intelligence directorate. Sending its director to a peace negotiation rather than a senior diplomat from the foreign ministry is an extraordinarily unusual choice. It tells you that Moscow views these negotiations through an intelligence and operational lens rather than a diplomatic one. In later rounds, Russia switched to Vladimir Medinsky as lead negotiator. Medinsky's presence at the Istanbul talks in 2022 was already controversial because his opening remarks included a lecture concluding with the statement that we the Russians are killing Russians while simultaneously denying Ukrainian nationality in a room full of Ukrainian negotiators. He was sitting across the table from former Ukrainian defense ministers and generals, and his opening gambit was to lecture them about why they do not really exist as a separate nation. This is the man Russia sends to negotiate Ukraine's future. That choice is deliberate. It signals exactly how Moscow understands this process. Not as a negotiation between two sovereign states seeking a mutually acceptable outcome but as an administrative exercise in managing the terms of Ukraine's submission. The Ukrainian side has responded to this dynamic by making its own significant delegation change. Zelensky replaced his longtime chief of staff with military intelligence chief Kirilo Budanov, who has maintained contacts with the Russian side through prisoner exchange negotiations and has close ties to U.S. intelligence and military leadership. Ukraine is sending someone who understands both the military reality on the ground and the intelligence dimensions of the negotiating environment. Two intelligence chiefs sitting across a table from each other is not a peace negotiation. It is a strategic confrontation happening inside a diplomatic format, the territorial trap that no agreement can escape. Every analysis of the Ukraine-Russia negotiations eventually arrives at the same unavoidable obstacle. The territorial question is not a detail to be negotiated. It is a fundamental disagreement about whether Ukraine has the right to exist within its internationally recognized borders. Russia's position has not changed since before the invasion began. It claims sovereign territory over Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, and over 4 additional Ukrainian regions it declared annexed in 2022, including areas it does not fully control militarily. It demands international recognition of these claims as a precondition for any lasting peace. Ukraine's position is equally clear. It will not cede any territory under military pressure because doing so would both reward aggression and leave millions of Ukrainian citizens under Russian governance they did not choose. It seeks the restoration of its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. These positions cannot be bridged through technical negotiations. They represent mutually exclusive understandings of reality. Any agreement that satisfies Russia's territorial demands leaves Ukraine permanently diminished and sets a precedent that military conquest of sovereign territory is a viable and rewarded strategy in the 21st century. Any agreement that satisfies Ukraine's territorial demands requires Russia to accept the failure of its Central War objective. Harvard professor Allison's analysis suggested that Ukraine's strategic challenge is to find a way to trade the remainder of Donetsk for stronger security guarantees. That framing acknowledges a bitter truth. The territory question may not be resolvable at current levels of pressure. Ukraine might be forced to accept a frozen line that does not reflect its legal rights in exchange for guarantees strong enough to prevent Russia from attacking again. But Russia has not accepted those guarantees either. The coalition of the Willings Paris commitments, including UK and French military hubs on Ukrainian soil, have been rejected by Moscow as a precondition for any agreement. Russia's stated position is that NATO troops cannot be on Ukrainian soil. Western Europe's security framework for post-war Ukraine requires exactly that presence. Both positions cannot exist in the same agreement. What the data says about who is actually winning. Strip away the diplomatic language and the Easter ceasefire statements and the negotiating round announcements, and what the raw data shows is this. Russia has suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since February 2022. That is the highest casualty figure recorded by any major military power in any conflict since World War II. The economic cost of the war combined with Western sanctions has severely damaged Russia's long-term productive capacity. Its defense industrial base is under extraordinary strain trying to replace destroyed equipment. North Korea and Iran have been supplying ammunition and drones to fill gaps in Russian military supply chains. A country that needs to import artillery shells from North Korea is not a country that is comfortably winning a war. Ukraine has suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties. Its energy infrastructure has been systematically targeted throughout 4 winters of war. Approximately 3.7 million Ukrainians remain internally displaced. More than 5.3 million have fled to other European countries. Its economy has contracted severely and its reconstruction costs are estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Both sides are paying an enormous price. Neither side is clearly winning in a way that makes continued fighting obviously rational. That should in theory create conditions for a negotiated settlement. But theory and practice diverge sharply when one side believes the other is on the verge of collapse. Russia's calculation that it can achieve a decisive breakthrough in 2026 before Ukraine's manpower pool runs dry and before Western resolve firms up again is the engine that keeps the war going. That calculation may be wrong. It was wrong in 2022 when Russia expected Kyiv to fall in 3 days. It may be wrong again. But as long as Moscow believes it is true, there is no genuine incentive to offer the kind of compromise that a real ceasefire process requires. The hidden truth behind every ceasefire announcement. What is being hidden between Russia and Ukraine is not a secret that requires access to classified intelligence. It is visible in the public record if you read it carefully and analytically. Russia announces ceasefires it does not intend to honor because ceasefire announcements serve a purpose even when they fail. They signal to international audiences, particularly in the global south, that Russia is the party seeking peace. They create pressure on Ukraine to respond proportionately during ceasefire windows, giving Russia's military brief periods to consolidate positions. They generate headlines that briefly interrupt the narrative of Russian aggression. And when they inevitably collapse, Russia attributes the failure to Ukrainian violations even when its own forces are responsible for the majority of breaches. The 2299 violations in 7 hours is not a malfunction. It is the system working as designed from Moscow's perspective. The ceasefire was never going to hold. Its purpose was not to hold. Its purpose was to be announced and then to be violated so that both sides could trade blame in the international press while the front line stayed exactly where Russia wanted it. The negotiating process follows the same logic. Russia participates in enough rounds of talks to satisfy the Trump administration's desire to show diplomatic progress. It agrees on enough procedural matters to generate optimistic statements from U.S. negotiators. It sends delegations that look official enough to appear serious. And on every question that actually matters it offers nothing and concedes nothing while its military continues grinding forward in Donetsk. Former CIA Director Burns said it most directly. Putin is not serious about peace at this point. That assessment from someone who has studied Putin for decades and has spent more time in Ukraine during this war than almost any other senior Western official is the most important piece of analysis in this entire picture. Not serious about peace. Not negotiating in good faith. Not interested in a deal that treats Ukraine's sovereignty as non-negotiable. What would change the equation? The question that follows from all of this is what would actually change Russia's calculation. Because the current trajectory leads toward one of two outcomes. Either Washington's attention and European resolve fragment enough that Ukraine is forced to accept terms that reward Russian aggression and set a precedent for the next conflict. Or the cost of continuing rises enough for Moscow that genuine negotiation becomes preferable to continued war. Atlantic Council analysis argues that only additional pressure can push Putin toward peace. Specifically, that means maintaining and increasing weapons supplies to Ukraine, increasing economic pressure on Russia through sanctions enforcement, and making clear to Moscow that the cost of holding out will continue to rise rather than fall as Western attention shifts elsewhere. The size framework describes a scenario in which Moscow's intentions are correctly read as hostile by both Washington and European capitals, and both commit to supporting Ukraine until Russia withdraws from all seized territory. That scenario requires a level of Western unity and sustained commitment that has been difficult to maintain across 4 years of war. Zelensky's warning about pressure in spring and summer of 2026 is particularly significant in this context. The combination of Washington's focus on Iran, the continued battlefield pressure in Donetsk, and the approaching manpower constraints on Ukraine's military creates a window in which Moscow may calculate it can secure more favorable terms than it could achieve by waiting. If that calculation is correct and Western resolve does not stiffen, the fake ceasefire and the fake negotiating process may eventually produce a real outcome. Just not the outcome that anyone claiming to support Ukrainian sovereignty would accept.